Today is Friday, March 19th, 2021, which means it's Derelict Friday. Hello, feedlings. How the hell are ya? Not a whole lot to report this week as I've been coding, bug fixing, and more or less trying to get back into the groove of things. New regimen, new issues, and holy shit, is there a lot of work to do on the house. Never ends. I'm sure many of y'all can relate. In honor of it being a Friday, and a beautiful one at that, I'm going to wrap this up and get some work done so I can sit out on the patio and write. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 16 of Derelict, Trident. Chapter 25. Talby finished mapping the civilian portion of the station. He'd found two more hotspots in the large, thick ring, both deep inside and close to the station's inner spine. According to the schematics, there was no reactor on that level of the spine. All the radiation was being caused by something else, and he damn well knew what that something else was. Once his Marines started moving into the station, they'd have to avoid that level at all costs. The radiation near the center of the ring had tilted into the lethal zone. Even inside a combat suit, you'd be cooked like a turkey in a solar oven. He doubted Dunn was going to like hearing that. He didn't find any damage to the hull plates on that ring, so how did the bastards get in? Talby moved to the first of two military personnel rings, where the quarters for the officers and non-coms had originally been intended. Since the station had little more than a skeleton crew, the area had been left vacant. The officers had claimed the other ring, while the non-coms had chosen to live on the same ring as their Marines. The bright spotlights covered the ring's ancient Atmos steel, Talby's filters removing the glare from his vision. Pockmarked by thousands of micrometeorite strikes, the dust brought by the solar winds, and simple age, the metal looked almost as distressed as the intact portions of Mira. Considering they were built within 20 years of one another, that shouldn't have been a surprise. As long as Talby had been at Trident Station, he'd never flown near the rings. It was forbidden unless you were on a training mission, which were always kept far away from the station itself, or a maintenance crew was inspecting the station's surface. Every now and then he came across a viewport, its blast shutter in place. The same had been true of the other ring, begging the question once again, how did the bastards get inside? That became readily apparent 10 meters later, when his lights caught sight of a jagged piece of metal sticking upward. He paused the craft's forward momentum and dimmed his lights. The last thing he wanted to do is give one of the creatures a photon boost before it attacked. With his low-light filters set to max, he was able to make out the lines of deep scratches in the Atmos steel surrounding the rent, as well as punctures from the creature's talons, or mouths. He shivered. This is how they'd gotten into red. One creature, presumably a massive starfish, had ripped open the skin, and in had come the little ones in search of... The thought trailed off into mental silence. What had they been looking for? Food? Energy from the reactors? What? He tapped the thrusters and rose another meter from the hull. His fingers carefully danced over the controls, and he changed the SV-52's attitude, so the nose pointed at the torn metal. Through the filters, he saw the damage to the interior. The pressure doors had obviously come down to keep adjoining bulkheads from losing atmosphere. Void. Maybe the emergency systems had already done that. But it didn't matter if anyone was in here at the time. They would have been flushed out into space immediately. The starfish, or its smaller brethren, had then collapsed two interior bulkheads, one leading to the corridor and one through the other side. Void wept, Talby breathed. The low-light filters weren't powerful enough to magnify much of the station's interior or enhance details. The computer was doing its best, but it needed more light. That wasn't something he was prepared to do at the moment. A few puffs from the forward thrusters, and the SV-52, still pointed at the rent in the hull, traveled backward a few meters. His heartbeat rose slightly as his fingers tapped the console next to the light controls. He wanted to know what was in there, how far back the damage was. He wanted to know, but was afraid to turn up the lights. After a moment's hesitation, he narrowed the focus considerably, transforming the bright spotlights that produced a wide ambient glare to a series of narrow beams that would lance the darkness. They wouldn't provide much in the way of ambient light, but if he moved the light arrays, he could have Black put together a composite of the captured images. It would be like erasing a layer of graphite on a piece of paper to reveal the ink beneath. Still, there was a risk. If the creatures were in there, and if the light struck them, there was a high probability they'd react in one of two ways: attack him or smother the lights. Either way meant damage to the SV-52 and the exhaustion of ammo he didn't have to spare. He paused again before widening the focus once more and sticking with the low-light filters. He had a probe, so why the void wasn't he using it? Because you're not thinking straight. Because you're panicked, another of those starfish things is going to come at you. And this time, there's no one to save your ass. True. He knew that without his subconscious whispering into his mind like some obnoxious drunken know-it-all at the officers' club. Yet he grinned sheepishly as he sent a block command and the last of his probes silently launched from its tube. The nanoprobe, larger than the model his Marines carried, was capable of wide and narrow light focus and maneuverability in microgravity. The problem was speed. If you were inside a ship, nanoprobes were a void send. You could toss one into a corridor, float it into enemy territory or toxic and hazard environs, and get a good feel for the target area before barging in. But they weren't designed to be flown fast unless you were willing to lose them. Their maneuverability suffered greatly at high speed, and they became little more than missiles with sensors. Inside a ship, going relatively slow was fine. Trident Station, however, was massive. Just as on Mira, nanoprobes weren't going to cut it, not if they wanted to know just what the void was going on inside the station. That would require power and for the security systems to function, or they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way, bulkhead by bulkhead, corridor by corridor, ring by ring. It would take more than a day with his current Marine count. Shut up, he told himself. Focus on figuring out how far back that damage goes. He added the probe feed to his HUD and waited impatiently as it floated to the hull at less than 2 meters per second. He lowered the probe's light array to provide just enough illumination for the filters. Any more than that would be dangerous. Dangerous, yes. So is sitting here with your thumb up your ass while you're pointing at a void-damned hostile egress. Tubby blinked twice. He gave the thrusters a few puffs and moved to the side of the rent. If something did come out of there, at least it would have to turn back to get at him. He hoped. The feed from the probe was good enough for the moment, showing him an array of damaged bulkheads and doors. Rips and tears through thick atmos steel, telltale signs of explosive decompression as well as an explosion or two. Whatever had happened in there had been devastatingly bad. The creatures now had dozens of ingress and egress points throughout the ring. They could be anywhere in there, and there could be any number of them. Talby shuddered at the thought. The probe continued further in, the feed starting to weaken in fidelity. Radiation, he thought. A moment later, the probe sent out its first radiation alert. The flashing yellow radiological sign pulsed several times as the readings continued rising. Even through the rapidly fragmenting images, he was able to see shapes moving some 20 meters away. Large shapes. The probe continued moving forward, its weak light providing just enough illumination for Black to fill in the blanks. Talby's mouth opened. The creatures had slammed through the thick atmos steel and made their way to the station's spine. The large cylinder upon which the rings rotated contained the majority of the life support systems, reactors, and the station's general infrastructure. The creatures were in there, no doubt huddling atop the cold reactors and soaking up any radiation they could. Something moved in the shadows and the feed went dead. Signal lost, flashed on his HUD. Talby felt as though someone had poured ice water down his back. Black?
Yes, Lieutenant.
He realized his voice was shaking and swallowed hard, doing his best to steady himself. They're in the spine.
Yes, Lieutenant.
A schematic appeared on Talby's HUD. Black had put together a 3D model of the ring, the damage calculated by her image analysis and where the creature concentrations appeared to be based on the radiation readings, as well as the few signs of movement the probe had sensed. Talby whistled. They'd not just made it to the spine, they were packed in there, at least based on the admittedly probe's relatively primitive sensors. Even then, Black had to interpolate microdifferentiations to guess at the number. Regardless, it was more than 20. Big ones. If we try and get to the personnel decks, we'll have to go through the spine.
That is correct, Lieutenant, unless, of course, the Marines enter from outside the rings.
Talby considered that for a moment. Assuming they could print some new skiffs and another SV-52, assuming they found ammo, and assuming they weren't eaten on the way to the ring, yes, that was a possibility. The odds sucked, but they were probably better than trying to go through the spine armed with nothing but a few dozen tritium flechettes, ineffective claymores, and stun rounds of which they were also nearly out of. They had to find some more weapons, and they had to find power to do it. And to find power, they had to go to the spine. A brief flash of futile rage spread through him, one fist hovering over the console as if to smash it. He slowly pulled back his hand and loosed a heavy sigh. Terrified one moment, vibrating with fury the next. The realization unsettled him. It was the way things had been after the satellite war, when he'd almost washed out of the SFMC and nearly killed himself in the bargain. "You're not letting that happen," a voice said in his mind. "You're going to get your Marines in here and get the fucking job done." "You're not letting that happen," a voice said in his mind. "You're going to get your Marines in here and get the fucking job done." Right. That had been his subconscious yelling at him in Gunny's voice. A dim smile crossed his face. "Aye, aye, Gunny," Talby said to no one. He blew out another sigh, checked his HUD to make sure nothing was incoming, and activated the command channel. "Talby to Dunn."
"Done here. I've seen the feeds. Over."
"Copy, sir. Unless you need me back in the barn, I'd like permission to scout the other rings." Dunn paused before replying.
"Scout, James. Do not, I repeat, do not engage."
"Aye, sir. Scout only, no engagement."
"And you fly yourself out of there the second you see one of those things coming at you. That's an order."
Talby fought to keep from laughing. "Aye, sir. Talby out." "Do not engage," he said aloud once the comms channel was off. "Like I'd have a choice." He moved to the next ring, his lights dim and his nerves jumping as his eyes flicked from window to window on his HUD. Void, but they needed Kelly Mora to hit the jackpot. Chapter 26. Instead of trying to drag individual slats of printer material, Dickerson had opted to disconnect the hoppers, maglock them to his gloves, and march them from blue to red to black. Great idea, except for the fact it took forever, and the off-center mass made it easy to lean too far and end up having to ditch the load or risk having it fall on top of him. While the slats wouldn't be damaged, his suit might be. Besides, he didn't want Kelly Morris seeing him look like an idiot. He'd already had enough of that, please and thank you. Wint eventually followed suit, the pair of them lugging the hoppers across the hangars while the rest of the squad provided cover. Not that they needed any. The creatures weren't in the hangar bays, but that didn't mean they weren't just beyond the bulkheads and waiting for a feast of photons or whatever it was they might get from consuming a human being. Also doesn't mean they're not hiding in the vents, he reminded himself. As he placed the last load next to the printers, he found himself staring upwards at the massive steel intake-outtake valves. A sudden image of those vent doors flipping open and jetting out streams of precious oxygen in addition to thousands of hand-sized starfish lit his mind. He shivered. Dickerson stepped away from the printers as Wint placed his load next to Dickerson's.
"Didn't know I was going to be a porter today,"
Wint said. Dickerson chuckled and stood near the bulkhead, his rifle back in his hands. Wint had already rearmed himself as well. Kellymore left Copenhaver and Carb to cover the hatch between black and red hangars and approached Wint and Dickerson. By the time she reached them, Noble appeared from the gangway, Murdoch in tow. Dickerson narrowed his eyes a little when he saw how the LT was magwalking. He looked awkward and terribly stiff. Dickerson hoped like Void the engineer didn't have to do anything strenuous in the near future. He didn't appear as though he was fit for much more than being in the rear with the gear. On second thought, Dickerson mused, that might exactly suit him. Still, Dickerson didn't want to be in his boots if the crew suddenly had to fight for their lives. As they'd learned on Mira, the creatures were incredibly agile in tight spaces and, while the Marines had to rely on their relatively clumsy suit thrusters to move around, the creatures moved through their microgravity with an unsettling grace. He still wasn't sure how they'd gotten through the infested Hulk without a KIA. It was a miracle they'd made it through there at all. Noble put his hands on his hips and surveyed the purloined hoppers.
"Outstanding,"
he said.
"Now, as soon as we get the ship refueled, we'll have some power."
The LT went silent for a moment, his head cocked slightly to the side as if he were listening to someone whispering in his ear. His helmet raised with an almost imperceptible nod.
The corporal will give you your assignments.
He glanced over at Murdoch.
Now you're going to learn how to print. Aye, sir,
Murdoch said. Calimora took a step forward.
Went, you're hangar sentry. Keep within 10 meters of the ship at all times. Dickerson, you're with me.
With that, she turned and mag-walked back toward Copenhagen and Carb.
Well,
Wentz said over private comms.
Guess I've been relegated to guard duty.
Bullshit, Dickerson said. You're the best for the job. Besides, I thought you'd be excited not to have to crawl through any tight spaces.
Right about that. But all this standing around?
Wentz shook his head.
Gives you too much time to think.
Heard that. Keep that kid from blowing y'all up. Wentz raised a mock salute.
Aye, aye, 3 bags full.
Laughing, Dickerson quickly mag-walked away, following Calimora to the hangar hatch. He didn't blame Wentz for being a little miffed at being left behind, but he thought Calimora had a good reason for it. He hoped she did. When they reached the hangar hatch, Calimora's voice erupted over the squad channel.
So here's how we're going to do this. Copenhagen, you're our rear guard. I'm going to drop a claymore 10 meters in, and I'll send you an alert if any of those things show up. You mean detonate?
Carp said.
That'll be the alert. Right.
Calimora said, annoyed impatience in her voice.
If that happens, be ready to close this hatch. Copy? Copy, boss.
Copenhagen said.
Carb, rear guard at red. Dickerson and I will do the same thing in there.
Dickerson coughed nervously. And what are we doing?
We,
Calimora said,
are going to check out those crates in Blue Hangar.
Dickerson sighed heavily. I had a bad feeling you were going to say that.
Come on, Dickerson.
Calimora said. Aye, aye, boss.